Chapter 9. Shane paced back and forth in front of the little arch that had been placed on the lawn behind the main ranch house. Judging by all the fairies and leprechauns placed at strategic places around the arch, and the 2 plaster bunnies on the ground beside it, he could guess who was responsible. He hoped the gnomes weren't offended. Oh, God. Did I seriously just think I hope the gnomes weren't offended? I'm losing my mind. She's taking my mind down this crazy path, and it's going to be long gone within a week. Bigfoot will be eating it with a knife, a fork, and a good red wine. Kelsi's brother, Will, wearing his best man suit and a pair of cowboy boots, walked over to him. She said to stop being nervous, and they'll both be ready within 10 minutes or so. Nervous? I'm not nervous. Shane didn't want anyone to think he was nervous. What if they lost respect for him? Will looked pointedly at the shredded carnation that had been in his lapel not 15 minutes before. You sure about that? Is there another one of these? Shane asked in a panic. Now nervous Kelsi would be angry that he'd shredded the flower he was supposed to wear. She's going to kill me. He needed everything to be perfect for his bride on her wedding day, and she'd chosen the carnations, so he would wear a carnation. Will laughed. Let me tell you something about Kelsi. He waited until Shane was looking at him before he continued. Kelsi is the most even-tempered of all 6 of us. She believes in forgiveness and love. She doesn't realize it yet, but she's actually the most romantic of our family, and she's always so happy to watch people fall in love. I think she watches the slasher movies so that people don't see her cry with joy when good things happen in real movies. Shane tilted his head to one side, considering. I guess that kind of makes sense from what I've seen. It opened up a new side to his sweet bride too. Trust me, there's a very soft side to my sister. You've made a good choice. And she has too. I've never seen a couple who is so right for each other. Will unpinned his ice blue carnation and pinned it on the sheriff's lapel. There. You look perfect. I'll go steal Wyatt's flower. He won't care, and he doesn't have to stand up. Shane took a deep breath. Thanks for the pep talk, man. No problem. But I bet the girls are about ready, so let me get that flower so I can be best man. Will grinned. I know you only chose me because Kelsi told you to, but you did get the best man. Shane laughed as he watched the older man walk off, shaking his head. What was it about those Westons that made them so competitive? He was almost surprised none of them had taken up an Olympic sport. It just seemed like something they would do in their family. Of course, with as devoted as they were to the family business, maybe it made sense. Training for the Olympics would take up a lot more time than any of them had available. 5 minutes later, he was standing beside Will in front of the arch when lively music began to play. He and Kelsi hadn't talked about music, so he was surprised. Why wasn't she walking to the wedding march like a normal person? Only Kelsi would walk down the aisle at her wedding to the William Tell overture. First he saw Danny, seeming to walk at a sedate pace, befitting a bridesmaid, but then getting into the spirit of the music and practically galloping to the arch. She gave him a very confused look as she took her spot, as if she had no idea how she'd gotten there so quickly. Then he turned his attention to watching as his bride left the house and headed his way. She wasn't doing anything sedately, because it wasn't in her nature. Instead, she bumped hips with the man escorting her and even gave a quick twirl on her way to him. He grinned, trying to figure out how he'd gotten so lucky as to find a woman like her to be his bride. He squinted, trying to see whose arm she held. He knew it couldn't be her father, and all her brothers were present and accounted for. And then he knew. Sam. The chef in her family's restaurant was walking her down the aisle. Maybe that was part of her reasoning for not wanting her mother there. She'd wanted to do things her own way, and no mother in her right mind would allow her daughter to walk down the aisle to the William Tell overture on one of the family employees' arms. Only Kelsi. When she reached him, it was all he could do not to reach out and move a strand of hair that was hanging a bit oddly from her mouse ears. It was probably meant to be that way, and he'd ruin her whole look if he tried to change it, so he didn't, taking her hand only when the pastor told him to. The ceremony was short, but it did the job. When he was told he could kiss his bride, the grin he gave her was part relief, but a whole lot of pride. Putting his hands on her waist, he drew her close to him, pressing his lips to hers. He lifted his head too quickly to Kelsi's way of thinking, so she wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling his head down for one more kiss. Shane heard the laughter of the few people she'd invited, but he didn't care. It was obvious she wanted to kiss him, so who could complain? After the pastor had introduced them to the crowd as Mr. and Mrs. Shane Clapper, they turned to face their audience. There were less than 20 people there, but Kelsi saw almost everyone she loved, and absolutely everyone she had wanted to be there. She was overwhelmed as she saw so many people who would die for her, and she had no doubt that every single one of them would. She took Shane's hand and dragged him over to Jacqueline Hardy. "Thank you for the arch, Jacqueline. It's perfect." The fairies suggested it. "I just did as they asked." "Well, I'm proud to have been married under it." Kelsi hugged the older woman tightly. "You're staying for food, right? We had the restaurant make all of their specialties." She hadn't seen Jacqueline this far from her home in years. Usually she put in orders for whatever she needed, so she was glad the woman was there. Since her grandma Kelsi had died, Jacqueline had become more and more of a recluse, preferring the company of her fairies and bunnies to the real world. Jacqueline nodded. "I wouldn't miss this for the whole world. You sit down, and I'll fix you a plate." Kelsi took the older woman's arm to walk her to a table. "No, you go fix your own plate. I told you before. I'm not sick, just old. The more I do for myself, the more I'll be able to do for myself. You're not running me off anytime soon." "Yes, ma'am," Kelsi answered, not bothered by her words. "You take care of yourself and I'll take care of myself." "Why would you take care of yourself when you have that sexy man to take care of you?" Jacqueline asked. Shane blushed. Was a woman old enough to be his grandmother allowed to call him sexy? He didn't know, but he was certainly a bit intimidated by it. Kelsi wandered through the crowd gathered for her wedding, finding her brother Wade and hugging him. "I know it worried you to not tell Mom, but thank you for respecting my wishes." Wade closed his eyes as he held her. "You sure do make my life difficult sometimes, Kelsi, but you're not too bad on the eyes. You have something going for you." "Uh-huh." Kelsi grinned over at Shane. "Let's eat. And then we need to cut the cake, but real food first." "How are you going to be happy with the food? You're not carrying your purse." She looked both ways to make sure no one was watching before pulling a tiny can of Cajun seasoning from her cleavage. "I've got it covered." Shane laughed, grabbing her and kissing her. "Life with you is never going to be boring, is it? Was there any other woman in the world who would carry Cajun seasoning in her cleavage at her wedding?" He knew his sweet bride was a one of a kind. "I sure hope not." 2 hours later, they were headed to his place, both of their trucks filled to the max with her things. It didn't seem like she had a lot until she started pulling the boxes out from under her bed. They met in the driveway of his house, and he sighed loudly, looking at the trucks. "This is going to be a lot of work. I'm not sure I want to do all this on my wedding day." "You don't have to." Didn't he have any idea of the family he'd married into? He frowned. "I guess I could leave it till tomorrow, but we only have one day off together before going back to work." "That's not what I mean." She jerked her thumb toward the street. What he saw was something beyond anything he'd dreamed of. All of her brothers, her sister, and her cousin were there, already dressed in casual clothes. One after the other, they carried boxes and armfuls of clothes into the house. 20 minutes later, There were many thank yous and hugs as everyone left as quickly as they'd come. That was unexpected, he said, looking at her. Now you know why I want 12 kids. Free labor at its finest. He took her hand and led her to the door, scooping her into his arms and carrying her over the threshold, before setting her on her feet in the living room. I still can't believe you wore red cowboy boots with your wedding dress. He shook his head. When you pulled up your skirt for that line dance, I almost fell over. I told you I was going to. They look good, don't they? She looked down at one of her boots, before looking at him with a grin. I may be strange, but I've always been this way. You chose me. He nodded, pulling her to him for a kiss. And I'd do it again every day for the rest of my life. She sighed, resting her head on his shoulder. She wished she could say the same. She wanted to tell him she loved him, because he deserved the words, but he didn't deserve to be lied to. No, she'd wait until she was ready. Asterisk. When Kelsi got to work early Saturday morning, she popped her head into the kitchen, expecting to see her sister getting ready to start her day. Instead, she saw Danny standing with a man she'd never seen before. He was handsome, but there was something that just seemed off. Hi, I'm Kelsi, she said. The man turned to her and grinned, and then she knew. Bobby Blakely. In her newlywed bliss, and being married to Shane could only be described as bliss, she'd forgotten all about Bobby coming. It should have been more awkward, but she didn't mind. A romance between the two of them could only have happened in her mother's mind. He shook his head. Just Bob now. I outgrew Bobby in the 6th grade. Welcome home, Kelsi said softly, refusing to be impolite, even though she wanted to yell at him to get out of her café. Thanks. And thanks for getting married before I got here. Do you realize your mother came to see me every day for a week, telling me that I needed to marry you, and only you? She told me Danny is all wrong for me, but you would be my perfect wife. He shuddered. I was afraid she was saying all the same things to you. She was, until I told her Monday morning that I'd gotten married. You married the sheriff, right? Bob grinned, waiting for her nod before continuing. Do you have any idea how relieved that makes me? Even if I was madly in love with you, I'm not stupid enough to take on a man who carries a gun for his job. Glad to hear it. Kelsi couldn't believe how relieved she felt. I'm glad you're going to be cooking for us. Mom says you're amazing. He wasn't going to be terrible to work with after all. She wanted to spread her arms and spin in circles, she was so excited. He nodded. I am. Do you have a problem if I play with the daily specials? Change things up a bit? Kelsi shrugged. I'm perfectly content with that. Just don't go too wild. Maybe make sure there's always one day per week where you fix one of Grandma Kelsi's special recipes. I'll do my best. Welcome to the team. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me. Kelsi shifted her attention to her twin. What are you still doing here? Go back to your ordering and other boring paperwork. You're not needed. Danny flashed a rare grin. I'm out of here. See you for supper tomorrow night. Whose turn is it anyway? Will's. When it was Will's turn, the same thing always happened. He went into town and bought pizzas for everyone. Pizza? Tell him I don't want one of your nasty everything pizzas. Something normal for me. Kelsi made a face. You tell him. He's your brother too. Yeah, but I just now got a reprieve and don't have to talk to anyone until dinner tomorrow night. I'll be in my own private version of paradise. And you've helped me a lot. So yeah, I'll call him. Whatever. Kelsi walked into the dining area and sat down, quickly tapping her brother's number. Will, Danny says only normal pizza for her. Will groaned. Is it my turn again? Every 7th week, Will. Mark it on your calendar. She hung up before he could complain more, taking a few moments for herself to sit with her thoughts. She wasn't nearly as disgusted with Bob as she'd expected to be. She had seen no turtles, lizards, or snakes on his person, and she'd looked. Maybe he'd grown up, just like the rest of them. Wouldn't that be something after all the worrying she'd done? When Shane came in for lunch at 11, she sat down across from him as always, putting her feet on his lap for him to rub. He didn't need to ask what she wanted, immediately sliding her shoes off and massaging her feet, knowing they stayed sore with the hours she worked. How's it going today? Really good. Bob is here, so Danny's finally off in her little hole of an office, and she's content. He's not nearly as bad as I remembered, so I'm happy too. Attractive? Kelsi shrugged. How am I supposed to know? You don't know when a man is attractive? Shane raised an eyebrow at her. I only have eyes for my new husband. He's the sheriff around here, you know. Shane grinned. Whether you mean it or not, you sure do know all the right words to say. Kelsi laughed. Well, you did promise to take me on a Bigfoot excursion later. No one in her life had ever been willing to hunt Bigfoot with her as often as Shane has. It made her happy. Get a lunch to take with us. She nodded. I'll pop into the kitchen and ask Bob for one. He's going to start doing boxed lunches for anyone who wants them on Monday. $15 for a lunch for two, including 2 bottles of water. Not a bad deal if you don't want to do for yourself. She sighed. What you're doing to my feet is positively wicked. Would you stay all day so I can take periodic breaks? He laughed. I have a lot to do today. Like what? Someone needs to grocery shop. I figured once I had a wife, she'd do that kind of thing, but no. She works 6 days a week. He frowned at her. Well, that's a sexist attitude. She grinned. Now that I have a real cook, I could probably cut down to 5 and spend my weekends grocery shopping with you. Shane nodded. I would love that. And then I can put every jalapeno pepper you try to buy back into the produce section where it belongs. She hopped up and leaned down to kiss his cheek, sliding her feet back into her shoes. What do you want for lunch? Today's soup is gumbo, and the special is blackened chicken. It's Saturday. What about the steak? New cook. What will you have? He grumbled, you're going to have to start bringing me a menu. I'll take the gumbo and the blackened chicken, but if it's not good, you'll have to bring me something else. It's good. Kelsi spun around to go put his order in. Bob looked over at Kelsi as she gave Shane's order. You look like you were just energized. My husband is here, and he gave me a foot massage. Seeing him helps, and the foot massage puts me in a blissful place. Works for me. He quickly put a piece of chicken, already seasoned, into the oven. I have to meet this fabulous sheriff of yours. Oh, sure. Come on. Kelsi led Bob out to meet Shane. Bob, this is my husband, Shane. Shane, this is Bob, of the reptile reputation. Bob groaned loudly. I thought you'd forgotten about the reptiles. Never. I will forgive you for the reptiles though, if you do a good job. Looking back and forth between them, Shane saw what her mother had seen. They would have made a good couple. They had similar high energy, peppy personalities. It's nice to meet you, Bob. His hand reached for Kelsi's to stake his claim. He wondered how long he'd feel insecure when he saw her with another man. Bob nodded. Nice to meet you as well. Her mother. Shane grinned at that. I know. She was hearing it too. Welcome to Riston. He was glad the other man made it obvious he had no interest at all. I feel like I'm home again. Bob put his hand on her arm. Back to the kitchen with me. I'll have the gumbo ready in a minute. Why am I jealous of a man whose arrival you've been dreading for weeks? She leaned down and kissed him, pulling away when the door opened and a large party of guests of the ranch came in. No idea, but you have nothing to be jealous about. I'm going home with you. She glanced over her shoulder. Back to work with me. I'll see you around 3. I've arranged for a 4-wheeler. Just one, he asked, surprised she didn't want to race again, and cheat. She shrugged. I kind of like your arms around me while I drive it. He chuckled softly. That works for me. It does make it so much nicer. As she served the guests, her mind was still on Shane. He was uncertain of her for one reason and one reason only. She hadn't told him she loved him yet. She sighed. She'd felt nothing for the other guys she dated, but was what she felt for Shane love? How did a person know they were in love? Maybe it was time for another visit to Jacqueline. Lately, the older woman seemed to have all the answers. Yeah, but I just now got a reprieve and don't have to talk to anyone until dinner tomorrow night. I'll be in my own private version of paradise. And you've helped me a lot. So yeah, I'll call him. Whatever. Kelsi walked into the dining area and sat down, quickly tapping her brother's number. Will, Danny says only normal pizza for her. Will groaned. Is it my turn again? Every 7th week, Will. Mark it on your calendar. She hung up before he could complain more, taking a few moments for herself to sit with her thoughts. She wasn't nearly as disgusted with Bob as she'd expected to be. She had seen no turtles, lizards, or snakes on his person, and she'd looked. Maybe he'd grown up, just like the rest of them. Wouldn't that be something after all the worrying she'd done? When Shane came in for lunch at 11, she sat down across from him as always, putting her feet on his lap for him to rub. He didn't need to ask what she wanted, immediately sliding her shoes off and massaging her feet, knowing they stayed sore with the hours she worked. How's it going today? Really good. Bob is here, so Danny's finally off in her little hole of an office, and she's content. He's not nearly as bad as I remembered, so I'm happy too. Attractive? Kelsi shrugged. How am I supposed to know? You don't know when a man is attractive? Shane raised an eyebrow at her. I only have eyes for my new husband. He's the sheriff around here, you know. Shane grinned. Whether you mean it or not, you sure do know all the right words to say. Kelsi laughed. Well, you did promise to take me on a Bigfoot excursion later. No one in her life had ever been willing to hunt Bigfoot with her as often as Shane has. It made her happy. Get a lunch to take with us. She nodded. I'll pop into the kitchen and ask Bob for one. He's going to start doing boxed lunches for anyone who wants them on Monday. $15 for a lunch for 2, including 2 bottles of water. Not a bad deal if you don't want to do for yourself. She sighed. What you're doing to my feet is positively wicked. Would you stay all day so I can take periodic breaks? He laughed. I have a lot to do today. Like what? Someone needs to grocery shop. I figured once I had a wife, she'd do that kind of thing, but no. She works 6 days a week. He frowned at her. Well, that's a sexist attitude. She grinned. Now that I have a real cook, I could probably cut down to 5 and spend my weekends grocery shopping with you. Shane nodded. I would love that. And then I can put every jalapeno pepper you try to buy back into the produce section where it belongs. She hopped up and leaned down to kiss his cheek, sliding her feet back into her shoes. What do you want for lunch? Today's soup is gumbo, and the special is blackened chicken. It's Saturday. What about the steak? New cook. What will you have? He grumbled, you're going to have to start bringing me a menu. I'll take the gumbo and the blackened chicken, but if it's not good, you'll have to bring me something else. It's good. Kelsi spun around to go put his order in. Bob looked over at Kelsi as she gave Shane's order. "You look like you were just energized." "My husband is here, and he gave me a foot massage. Seeing him helps, and the foot massage puts me in a blissful place. Works for me." He quickly put a piece of chicken, already seasoned, into the oven. "I have to meet this fabulous sheriff of yours." "Oh, sure. Come on." Kelsi led Bob out to meet Shane. "Bob, this is my husband, Shane." "Shane, this is Bob, of the reptile reputation." Bob groaned loudly. "I thought you'd forgotten about the reptiles." "Never. I will forgive you for the reptiles though, if you do a good job." Looking back and forth between them, Shane saw what her mother had seen. They would have made a good couple. They had similar high energy, peppy personalities. "It's nice to meet you, Bob." His hand reached for Kelsi's to stake his claim. He wondered how long he'd feel insecure when he saw her with another man. Bob nodded. "Nice to meet you as well." Her mother. Shane grinned at that. "I know." She was hearing it too. "Welcome to Riston." He was glad the other man made it obvious he had no interest at all. "I feel like I'm home again." Bob put his hand on her arm. "Back to the kitchen with me. I'll have the gumbo ready in a minute." "Why am I jealous of a man whose arrival you've been dreading for weeks?" She leaned down and kissed him, pulling away when the door opened and a large party of guests of the ranch came in. "No idea, but you have nothing to be jealous about. I'm going home with you." She glanced over her shoulder. "Back to work with me. I'll see you around 3. I've arranged for a 4-wheeler. "Just one?" he asked, surprised she didn't want to race again and cheat. She shrugged. "I kind of like your arms around me while I drive it." He chuckled softly. "That works for me. It does make it so much nicer." As she served the guests, her mind was still on Shane. He was uncertain of her for one reason and one reason only. She hadn't told him she loved him yet. She sighed. She'd felt nothing for the other guys she'd dated, but was what she felt for Shane love? How did a person know they were in love? Maybe it was time for another visit to Jacqueline. Lately, the older woman seemed to have all the answers. After work on Monday, Kelsi decided to go see her fairy-loving friend instead of hurrying straight home. It was her turn to cook supper, and she was thrilled to have a husband who agreed they should take turns, but she'd started a spicy chili in the crock-pot before leaving for work that morning. As she ambled across the expanse of land toward Jacqueline's, she smiled at the flowers that were starting to bloom all around her. It was hard to believe she'd started dating Shane just 3 weeks ago, when there was still snow on the ground, and now they were married and the world was starting to look like spring. April was one of her favorite months of the year, because of the change in the weather, and now her anniversary would help her remember to celebrate it by smelling every flower along the way. The last of the ice had melted from the lake when they'd gone down to sit by it and talk the previous evening. Soon it would be time for the tourists to start pouring in. They had a steady stream all year, of course, but the summer was their busiest time. The ranch had so much to offer, from trail rides, the RV park, a 9-hole golf course, to a tent campground and even river rafting. The old west town they'd built was also a big draw, providing first aid, an ice cream shop, and even a general store. She couldn't wait to go rafting herself as soon as it was warm enough. It was one of her favorite things to do, probably because her favorite brother was head of it all. Will was in charge of all aquatics on the ranch, and he was fabulous with guests. Kelsi just wished he was better at managing employees. He was often taken advantage of, because he was just so affable. He managed not only the river and lake activities, but also the pool. Maybe he was spread too thin and needed an assistant? She had no answers, and she was glad she didn't need them. She'd rather leave management of everything to Wade, who handled it so much better than she ever could. She navigated through the garden creatures at Jacqueline's and knocked on the door. When Jacqueline opened the door, Kelsi smiled. "I need to talk. The tea and snickerdoodles are waiting. Come in. Come in." Jacqueline's eyes lit up when she saw her, every time she saw her. Kelsi needed to make more of an effort to see the older woman, reminding her that she wasn't forgotten and still loved by many. "You knew I was coming." It wasn't a question. Jacqueline always seemed to know when Kelsi would be visiting. "The fairies don't like me to be surprised after what happened to poor George." Jacqueline invited her inside by opening the door wider. Kelsi could see the tea tray was already on the table, one cup full of milk and the other filled with tea. She walked in and took a seat on the couch, reaching for her milk and cookies. She ate a whole cookie in silence, not sure how to bring up her problem. "Just spit it out. I don't have time to sit here all day waiting for you to figure out what you want to say." Jacqueline took a sip of tea while she waited, impatiently as usual. "Well," Kelsi took a deep breath and another sip of her milk. "How do you know when you love someone?" She felt stupid asking, but at least she was asking Jacqueline and not Will or Danny. They'd have both laughed hysterically like she'd lost a little piece of her mind. Okay, another huge chunk of her mind. "Whatever." Jacqueline smiled. "It's different for everyone. Tell me this, though. Close your eyes and picture yourself in 10 years. Is he there?" Kelsi nodded. "Of course. Where else would he be?" "He was Shane." 20 years? "Yes, and adult children, and that's downright scary." She shuddered at the thought of making it through the teen years, immediately wondering if she should rethink the number of children she wanted. "Now, open your eyes for a moment." After Kelsi had complied, Jacqueline asked, "Is there anyone else you would rather be there than him?" Kelsi shook her head. "No. Not at all. Close your eyes again, and let me tell you a story. Once upon a time, about 50 years ago, there was a young woman who thought she had the whole world at her feet. There was a young man she wasn't quite sure she loved, but she cared for him a great deal, and she sometimes went out with other men as well. One day, her young man, a police officer, stopped by her house on his way to work. He told her he loved her and he wanted her to be his wife. Okay, Kelsi wasn't sure where the story was going, but she was already enthralled. She could see the comparison to her own life. She wasn't sure what she wanted to do. She liked her carefree lifestyle, but she cared a great deal for the young man as well. She promised him she'd give him an answer before the end of the day. Jacqueline took a deep breath. He said he'd come by as soon as he finished work for the day, because he needed her answer. She went about her daily business as a wealthy young lady. She spent the day shopping with some of her friends. She made sure she was home at 5, though, because she knew that would be about the right time for her young man to come. She still wasn't sure if she loved him, and she didn't know what she'd say. Kelsi smiled, picturing the scene. Did she say yes? She never had the chance. You see, that young man, who had been in love with her for 3 years, who had asked her to marry him more than once, and always received the answer, "Not yet," died in the line of duty that day. When she got the news, that's when she knew. She'd always been able to picture her life with him, but when asked to picture her life without him, she dropped to her knees with grief. She couldn't imagine growing old without him at her side. She couldn't imagine ever smiling again if he wasn't with her. And then she knew she loved him. Then, when it was too late to tell him. When it was too late to have his children. Kelsi felt tears stream down her cheeks. I don't like this story. Picture your life without him, Kelsi. Can you do that? Jacqueline asked softly. Kelsi opened her eyes, shaking her head. No, I can't. I don't want to have a life without him. The very idea hurt her. No, she needed Shane beside her every day for the rest of her life. Then you have your answer. Kelsi reached out a hand and squeezed the older woman's. What was the girl's name? Jacqueline. And she still thinks of her young police officer every day. Jacqueline's eyes focused on the table between them, and Kelsi saw something that she knew had never been there before. It was a picture of a handsome young police officer with a smiling girl clinging to his arm. I'm so sorry. Jacqueline nodded. Me too. Not that he died, because I believe that was out of my control. I'm sorry I never told him I loved him. That I didn't have those children to raise after he was gone. She shrugged. My heart was buried with him. Kelsi grabbed a tissue to blow her nose and wipe away the tears. Thank you for your story. What was his name? It was Barry. Jacqueline smiled. His sister's name was Kelsi. She helped me through it. You would have been my aunt. Kelsi had no idea her grandmother had lost a brother who was a police officer. She wondered why it had never come up in their long talks together. I feel like I am anyway. Don't you? Chapter 10. Kelsi could think of nothing but the talk she'd had with Jacqueline for the rest of the afternoon. She did some laundry and finished cooking supper, her heart broken for the older woman. No wonder she talked to fairies. She hoped one of them had her Barry's voice. She had the table set and dinner ready to be served at 5, knowing Shane would be home just a few minutes later. She put candles in the middle of the table, ready to have a nice romantic evening with the man she loved. She even had a movie picked out that didn't involve blood and guts. She'd gone with an old Superman movie instead, knowing he'd rather not see people's brains gush out their ears, no matter how much she liked it. She was curled on the couch, reading one of her favorite books, her mind half on the book and half on what she was going to say to Shane when he came home, when her phone rang. It wasn't until then she realized he was late. With trepidation she checked the display, frowning as she answered it. Hi, Mom. Hi, Kelsi. It was the first time her mother had called her since she'd told her about marrying Shane, so she wasn't sure if this was going to be a good call or not. Where are you and Dad now? She asked, acting as if nothing had happened. There was a pause. We're in Florida. With all the times we've been to Disneyland, we thought it was time we tried Disney World. It's so big in comparison. Kelsi grinned, knowing she'd been forgiven. She'd known she would be, but she didn't know when. Have you been to all the parks yet? Yes. I think Epcot is my favorite by far. Kelsi sat back and listened to her mother go on and on about the wonders of Disney World, but the longer they talked, the more concerned she became. Shane hadn't been late getting home from work since they'd married, and he was more than an hour late already. Finally, her mother changed the subject. So how's married life? Are you and the sheriff getting along? Kelsi smiled as she thought of the man she loved, glancing toward the door, hoping she just hadn't heard him come in somehow. Yeah. He's really a wonderful man, and I'm lucky to have him. I'm glad you're happy. Let Wade know the first part of our instructions will be coming this week. Wait, the first part? I thought there was one test we had to pass. Why did her mother have to make everything so complicated? Oh, there is. It just comes in multiple parts. I love you. The phone went dead, and Kelsi stared at it for a moment before walking to the door and peering out the window. Where could he be? She quickly dialed his number, saying a little prayer that he'd answer. She couldn't remember being this frightened in years, and she watched horror movies by the dozens. Shane answered, sounding tired. Hey, you. She breathed again. Are you all right? She wanted to yell at him for being late and not calling, but what good would that do? She wanted them to grow closer, not drive a wedge between them. There was a kerfuffle in town today. 2 men were fighting over the last grocery cart, and I got hurt trying to break them up. Kelsi bit her lip, unsure of whether to laugh or cry. How hurt? Stitches on my arm. One of them shoved me, and I fell and cut my arm. I'm just now leaving the hospital. I'll be there in 30 or so. Do I need to come get you? Can you drive? Trust Weston to be a place where the sheriff got hurt breaking up a fight over a grocery cart. No, I'm fine. Bart drove me, and he waited. He'll bring me home. All right. I'll see you soon. She paced back and forth, wondering how deep the cut was for him to have stitches. She'd seen her brothers go through all sorts of minor injuries over the years, and she herself had broken an arm skiing when she was younger. Still, she worried. When she heard a car in the drive, she ran to the door, flinging it open. Bart was there, standing by as if he was sure he needed to help Shane. Thanks for bringing him home, Deputy Bart. You got it, Mrs. Clapper. She started at the sound of her new name. It seemed strange, because she hadn't used it yet. Do you need help? She asked, worried at the size of the bandage on his arm. No, I'm fine. He shook his head, a bit pale, but otherwise no worse for the wear. My first work-related injury, and I fell and sliced my arm on a broken jar of jam. The disgust in his voice over the way the injury had happened told her that it wasn't serious. She bit her lip, struggling not to giggle at the disgruntled sound of his voice. Come on. I have dinner waiting. As soon as he was in the house, Bart touched the brim of his hat and left to get in his car. Thank you. Kelsi called. Bart waved as he pulled out, and Kelsi walked behind Shane, making sure he got to the table. Are you hungry? I made chili. He nodded. Starving, actually. Did you make it too hot? He looked at her warily, nervous about eating food she considered fit for human consumption. He didn't know how she did it. She shook her head. I have seasoning to add. She put a bowl in front of him and sat down with her own. She shook both Cajun seasoning and chili powder into her bowl before tasting it, making sure it was seasoned to her taste. Can you work tomorrow? Should I call and say I need to stay home with you? I can go in. They don't want me to drive till the stitches are out, but I can do the paperwork I keep avoiding. I'm sure I have enough to keep me busy for a month. It will teach me to get between two great-grandfathers fighting over a grocery cart. He shook his head, obviously exasperated. She hid her grin. Okay, but if you need me, give me a call. I can leave work if I need to. Absolutely not. Shane noticed the candles on the table for the first time. Was there something special going on tonight? He felt awful that she'd gone to extra trouble, and he hadn't been there to celebrate whatever it was she was excited about. Kelsi wasn't sure it was a good time to tell him with his injury and all. Well, we have been married 8 days now. She said it with so much enthusiasm, he had to laugh. A whole 8 days? Sounds like reason to celebrate to me. She grinned at that. I saw Jacqueline for a little while today. The fairies weren't mean to you, were they? Bigfoot and I will go after them if they were. Just give me a few days to heal. Teasing her about Bigfoot came as naturally as kissing her. She made a face. The fairies are never mean to me. They love me. No, I stopped by for a chat. I try to check on her at least once a week, but she would hate it if she knew that. She shook her head. Stubborn and bullheaded didn't begin to describe Jacqueline. He nodded. I can see that. She seems very independent. She never married. Shane shrugged. I assumed as much since she's Miss Hardy and not Mrs. Hardy. Why bring that up now? She told me a story today. Kelsi looked down at the table, wondering how much she should tell him. If it was about the fairies, I'm not sure I can handle it. She shook her head. No, it wasn't about the fairies at all. In a way it was about how she met my grandmother, but not really. Are you planning to tell me this story? Or will you make me guess? Whatever it was she'd talked to Jacqueline about, it was obviously very important to her. Kelsi sighed. You don't need to hear the whole thing. You just need to know that she helped me realize I'd been really wrong about something. He frowned, a bite of chili paused in front of his mouth. About what? I found Bigfoot. He blinked a few times. You found Bigfoot? She couldn't be serious. No, but I did realize I love you. He tilted his head to one side, considering her. Maybe I do need to hear this whole story. She shrugged. Probably not. It just made me realize that I've loved you for a while, but never having been in love before, I didn't recognize the signs. She felt stupid admitting it, but it was the truth. Besides, if you couldn't be stupid in front of the man you loved, who could you be stupid in front of? He reached with his good hand to grip one of hers. I love you too. I know. And that's why I was so excited to be able to tell you. She took a drink of her water. I'm not sure why it took me so long to realize it, but I promise, I won't forget again. She'd spend the rest of her life loving him, just as Jacqueline had spent the rest of her life loving Barry. Maybe it was silly, but she knew no matter what happened, she'd never regret loving him. After their meal, she cleaned up without complaint, but she did remind him that he would need to wash dishes for a week straight when his hand healed. Fair is fair, she said, her eyes twinkling. When she joined him in the living room on the couch, she curled against his good side, her head on his shoulder. Shane's hand stroked over her hair, which was down around her shoulders, for a change. Are you sure? Kelsi nodded. I couldn't be certainer. He grinned, resting his forehead against hers. Sometimes I wonder how I was so lucky as to have you for my wife, and then I remember we're both lucky, because so many people don't find real love. And we did. I'm never letting it go either. Asterisk. Kelsi was surprised to see Danny at the cafe the following morning, shortly before the lunch rush would have started. She hadn't expected to see her in the cafe for a few months after having to work there for 3 weeks. Boring banker, Fred Wharton III, walked into the cafe and slipped into the booth with her sister. Kelsi rolled her eyes. Danny was the only person she knew that he went out of his way to talk to. Kelsi walked to the table and smiled. What can I get for you two? She looked back and forth between them, desperately hoping to know what was going on through the twin radar, but apparently it wasn't working that day. Danny shrugged. What's the soup today? I'm hearing good things about Bob's soups. And is there a new menu? Normal menu is still the same. Soup is potato leek. Special is jambalaya. He set aside a small pot with extra spices, just for me. He said I wouldn't be able to eat it, and I told him if he could eat one bite, I could eat a whole bowl. Kelsi loved to prove people wrong where spices were concerned. It was yet another thing she'd inherited from Grandma Kelsi, who would always be the woman she looked up to more than any other. Fred raised an eyebrow at her as if she was disturbing them. Kelsi rolled her eyes back at him. What will you have? Her voice was as sweet as she could make it, but she wanted to poke him in the eye with a fork. She didn't trust him. At all. I'll try the jambalaya. The kind for everyone but you. Danny said, looking at the banker. I'd like Coke with a twist of lemon and the sirloin, medium well, with steak fries please. Okie dokie. I'll be back with your drinks in a minute. Kelsi hurried to the kitchen and gave Bob the order before taking the drinks out. After she delivered them, she spotted Shane walking into the cafe. She hurried to him. What are you doing here? You're not supposed to drive. How had he gotten there? He'd better not be going against doctor's orders already. He shrugged. I had Bart bring me. He'll be back in an hour to pick me up. What happens if you're not finished in an hour? He can sit in his car and wait. I'm the boss. Shane winked at her. she laughed. Why, Sheriff? You're in a naughty mood today. Soon you'll know me well enough to realize that I'm in a naughty mood every day. Getting into the booth with him as usual, Kelsi didn't put her feet in his lap for a change. She didn't want him to think she expected him to rub her feet when he was injured. She'd wait until his arm was all better and then demand her foot rubs, like any reasonable woman would. How's the paperwork coming? He groaned. Awful. Of course. Do you know how much I hate paperwork? I probably have 3 months' worth I have to do. It's a good thing you hurt your left arm and not your right. Kelsi refused to feel sorry for him. She hated paperwork as well, but she did a little every week so she wouldn't get bogged down. Who's the stuffed shirt with Danny? I thought you knew everyone around. That's Fred Wharton III, he works at the bank, and he's one of Mom's spies. Oh. Have you heard from your mom since you told her we got married? He hated the idea of coming between her and her mother, but he would never regret marrying her. Yeah, I forgot to tell you. She called yesterday while I was waiting for you to come home, and she told me that we'd find out the first part of our test this week. She rolled her eyes. I don't want to be part of this test. It's already making me mad. No idea what it is? Or what this part of it is? He frowned. I thought there was supposed to be one test. I guess she's doing it in pieces. Is that fair? Nope. Maybe Freddie boy is over there telling Danny what we have to do. Shane looked over his shoulder. You really don't like him, do you? I just don't like that he reports back to Mom. It makes me mad. Kelsi looked over at her sister, who was leaned forward, speaking earnestly with the banker. I wonder what they're talking about. She was quiet for a moment, trying to listen to what the other couple was saying, but they were speaking too softly. I'm sure Danny will tell you when they're done. Probably. She scooted out of the booth. Soup today is potato leek. Special is jambalaya. Jambalaya sounds interesting. Is Bob going to change everything? Kelsi shrugged. He'll still rotate in some of Grandma Kelsi's recipes, but he has some of his own too. I think he's just happy to be able to cook some of his own stuff. I don't like him, Shane said, knowing he sounded like a belligerent child. I wish he hadn't come back. He didn't like that the other man got to spend all day, every day with Kelsi, and now he was showing off his ability to cook fancy foods. Shane could cook, but only simple things. Why don't you like him? Kelsi looked toward the kitchen. I expected to hate him, but he's really not that bad. He came back here to marry you. Shane protested. No, he didn't. That's what Mom wanted. He was relieved I was already married before he got here. He told you that? Yes, he did. He had no more interest in me than I had in him. He just had fond memories of the area and wanted to be in charge of his own café. I'd have come back under those circumstances as well. Shane didn't look convinced. Fine, I'll eat his jambalaya. He made it sound like he was doing the other man a huge favor by eating his food. Kelsi saw Liz and Joni come in, back from their break for the lunch rush. You know what? I'm going to let the other waitresses handle things for a bit, and I'm going to have lunch with my husband. She rarely took a lunch break, but they were never very busy on Mondays. It would be nice to sit and eat a leisurely meal for a change. That sounds good to me. Kelsi rushed off to get the jambalaya Bob had made for her, and some of the milder version meant for Shane. Bob followed her out. I need to see you eat at least 5 bites of it. He crossed his arms over his chest, making Shane think he wouldn't back down. Kelsi rolled her eyes. He thinks he made a separate pot of jambalaya too spicy for me. Nothing was too spicy for her. She kept telling him that, but he wouldn't listen. Shane laughed softly. She burned off all her taste buds years ago. Bob made a face. He carried a small spoon and stuck it into her bowl, taking one bite. His face turned red and he grabbed Kelsi's water, drinking it down. "I'll bring you more," he choked out as he ran to refill it. Shane watched as Bob drank 2 more glasses, before bringing her a fresh one back. "Is this some kind of bet?" "Of course. I get to pick who he dates if I can eat this." Kelsi grinned at Shane. Shane laughed. "He's toast." "Yup." She waited as Bob set the water on the table and then took a big spoonful of the jambalaya. "Not bad. Needs a little more seasoning." She looked at Bob. "Would you bring me the can of Cajun seasoning from the spice rack in the back?" Bob raised an eyebrow, but did as she asked. He watched as she poured more seasoning on the dish and then ate several bites. "Much better," Kelsi said. When the bowl was half gone, Bob was still gaping at her. "Don't you have orders to fill?" He walked back to the kitchen, turning periodically to look at her over his shoulder, obviously amazed anyone could eat the spicy concoction. "What would you have had to do if you couldn't eat it?" Shane asked. "He'd have gotten all my tips for the day." Shane shook his head. He had no idea what he was up against, did he? Kelsi kept an eye on the table where her sister and the banker were eating, taking note when he left. She had just finished her jambalaya, and she waved Danny over. "Any news?" Danny nodded, rubbing her hand over her face. "Mom's going to call Wade later this week, but her first demand for our test will be to expand the kitchen and make it possible for us to have formal events here." "Formal events?" Danny said, groaning as she slid into the booth beside her sister. "Where would we even have a formal event? We have no event halls big enough." "I bet that will be the second demand." Kelsi frowned at Shane. "We need to call a family meeting. Tonight. I know it's not normal for us to all get together on Mondays, but we all need to discuss this." "We need to invite Sam as well," Danny said automatically. "What about Wyatt? Isn't he supposed to take out a group on an overnight ride tonight?" Kelsi asked. "Glenn will have to take his place." Danny named Wyatt's right-hand man, his horse whisperer in training. Wyatt had a skill and a touch with horses that was a true gift, but Glenn was proving to be an apt pupil. He had the raw talent, but he had yet to learn everything Wyatt knew. Kelsi nodded. "I'll call everyone. Can you drop by the stables and beg Wyatt to skip his ride and come to the meeting? We all need to talk about this." Danny nodded, slipping back out to stand beside the table. "How was your extra spicy jambalaya?" "I had to add more seasoning." Danny rolled her eyes as she headed for the door. "Why am I not surprised?" Shane took Kelsi's hand, squeezing it. "Expanding the kitchen for events doesn't sound like that hard of a test," he said. Kelsi laughed. "It's hard when it's just stage 1. Before we're done, she's going to have us building a huge event hall, a church, and hiring a pastor. We'll have to build a carousel for the children that never come here. Probably even a mini golf course. You watch. She's got a whole lot more in mind than some little catering operation." "You know her better than I do." Kelsi squeezed his hand. "Looks like Bart just drove up." She scooted out and waited until he stood, wrapping her arms around his neck and pulling his head down for a lingering kiss, despite the fact the café had been gradually filling with customers. "I love you, Sheriff Shane." He grinned. "I'm never going to get tired of hearing you say that." He stroked his fingers over her cheek, not caring that his deputy was waiting for him. "Good, because now I've started, I'm not sure I'm able to stop." She watched him go, her heart full. Sure, there was about to be mass chaos on the ranch, but it didn't matter. She had the man she loved by her side. Together, they could do anything.